TV news, bringing blues, people with guns. Lord help each and every one. Talk to me so we can see what's going on there. What's going on there? What's going on? No. What's going on there?
Thank you, Tavis. So I have the same question that Tavis was singing about what is going on in our country right now. I don't know how many of you have watched the videos of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile dying, I know some people are choosing not to watch them because it's just too much. My husband is one of those people, and one of my daughters is too. Not watching is a way of not getting too traumatized or re-traumatized or too angry or feeling too helpless or even more afraid. It's also a way of avoiding conflict with our friends and our family and our neighbors and maybe even our fellow church members. Because the more polarized we get these days, the more painful it feels. I haven't talked to a person of color yet, though, who hasn't watched the videos. And because people are choosing sides and standing strong in their positions these days about whose lives matter more now, some of us are wondering, which is worse? A white police officer killing a black man? Or a black man killing a white police officer? So I'm watching all the videos and thinking a lot about race and about violence these days. Different people are seeing the world so differently right now, though, that I wanted to focus on something we all have in common, which is the violence. It's easy to let my mind fill with images of violence. I was raised with a television during the Vietnam War when we started watching images of a live war in our homes. And during the civil rights movement, when we started seeing images of white police officers using trained dogs and fire hoses to attack black men and women. My husband Rick was raised in Alabama, and he remembers seeing with his own eyes, not on television, white parents who were the authorities in his life at that point throwing bricks at the heads of black elementary school-aged children as they were walking into the first desegregated schools in Alabama. We've all seen, I imagine, photos and probably videos of the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it will be 71 years this August. So many shapes and sounds and colors and contours, so many images of violence in so many times and in so many places in our shared human history. And we're only skimming the surface so far this morning, really, but it's enough to make us think hard about violence. We all think about it, but we don't talk about it. Not enough, anyway. Like race, it's an inescapable part of human existence, even if it's a shameful one. And of course, shame loves secrets and hides in silence. So violence persists partly because we keep it hidden behind locked doors and policies to protect organizations from liability, or we turn it into entertainment. But whether we talk about it or not, violence permeates our personal and our political lives, our schools and our psyches, and it is heart-bruising and heartbreaking. So I'm thinking about violence this morning with you and race and how they intersect, and you may be too at home having these conversations, because we're about to have national conventions during the heat of summer in what I could only call an unusual election year, in which we were already having fights break out at political rallies this spring. And now we're having racially charged major demonstrations in our largest cities across the country. And we're holding horrifying images in our minds, not only from the 2 recent police killings of black men, but of the 5 fatal shootings of Dallas police officers, and of men wearing camouflage, openly and legally carrying rifles and assault weapons, moving through the crowds in Dallas. Did you see those pictures? As they are being fired upon by a citizen-turned sniper who was trained by our military. If you're not thinking about violence, you should be. We're holding images of a huge white truck driving through crowds of people celebrating liberté, égalité et fraternité, the founding principles of France's democracy, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. So we're going to talk about violence this morning because we're all involved, whether we want to be or not, because that's what it means to be part of a democracy. And this is a national epidemic. A national epidemic. That's how author and psychiatrist Dr. James Gilligan started to talk about violence in America in the mid-1990s. Gilligan was director of the Center for the Study of Violence at Harvard Medical School, and he spent 30 years working with our most violent offenders, providing psychiatric services inside the Massachusetts state prison system. He's written 2 books, Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, that I read from a little while ago, and Preventing Violence, and our book table will be purchasing both of these books. I highly recommend them. I pulled them off my shelf this week, started reading, and found this. All violence is an attempt to achieve justice. I'll let you sit with that for a minute as you test that statement against your own experiences with violence. All violence is an attempt to achieve justice. Now, depending on whether we've been the perpetrator or the victim of violence, our perspectives will vary, although I guess many of us have been both. Maybe it matters more which memory you land on, but before you get too far into your own arguments for or against this statement, I'll continue with Gilligan's words. All violence is an attempt to achieve justice, or what the violent person perceives as justice for himself or for whomever it is on whose behalf he or she is being violent. The attempt to achieve and maintain justice, or to undo or prevent injustice, is the one and only universal cause of violence. To undo or prevent injustice. What I love about Gilligan is that he steers us away from a morality play about good versus evil, light versus dark, and into the heart of the tragedy we're all living in, encouraging each and every one of us to peer into the darkest corners of our own psyches, so we can begin to treat violence and violent behaviors the way we would any other mental health issue, as something life-threatening with multiple causes and multiple treatments to prevent it. Remember, we treat illnesses, we don't punish them, right? I like his approach because it aligns really well with our theology, which affirms that we are all born with original blessing, not original sin. And so we all have the same capacity to do harm and to do good and to do evil. I like his approach, especially because I know I have violence and prejudice inside of me. I have lashed out at my children, verbally and physically, before I could stop myself. I have felt such rage and fear, and often the two come together and are difficult to distinguish or pull apart, that I've used my hand to hit a close friend and a stranger. I want to tell you the story about the stranger this morning. I've told the story about the friend before in this sanctuary. It happened a long time ago. I was young and traveling alone in Southeast Asia. No one's ever said I lacked courage, but sometimes I lack common sense. I was on a boat in Indonesia, a nation made of islands. The boat was tiny, and it was full to overflowing with women of all ages, men and women, but women who had boxes and bags and jugs of water and wiggling children and chickens. It was a 24-hour trip, all of us together, and there were men on board too, although they hung out and slept on deck, while the women stayed and slept below. It was near the island of Sumatra, which is a majority Muslim country. And when it was finally time to disembark, I gathered my few things and started to make my way toward a wooden plank stretched across the side of a boat onto another boat, which had another plank stretching to another boat and another boat until you finally reached the shore. That was the way to shore. So I moved shuffling along, crowded among all these different people, and a man came up and grabbed me from behind. I was surprised and horrified, and I turned, stared at him for a split second, and then I slapped him as hard as I could. And he stared at me for a split second, and then he laughed. The laugh was much worse than the grab. The grab made me angry, but it gave me that energy to fight back. The laugh made me feel small and sick and mean. And those feelings made me freeze. It's taken me years to understand what happened and how I felt when it was happening. And Gilligan's work has helped me a lot. You see, 30 years of research and study and conversation with murderers, mostly men, gave Gilligan an insight which he later humbly realized was included in the first recorded murder in Western history, the murder of Abel by Cain, of course. It says in Genesis, right in chapter 4, verses 1 through 8, the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain he had not respect. The more Gilligan read, the more he found his core insight reflected in the work of great philosophers and theologians. Aristotle and Aquinas state that the desire to assault or injure others is caused by the feeling of having been slighted, insulted, ridiculed, disdained, dishonored, disrespected, or dissed by them. Hegel, the great political philosopher, claimed that the desire to be recognized, to be seen, heard, respected, and honored was the central motive behind all human history. And even Karl Marx agreed that shame, the emotion we feel when we are not recognized or respected, is the emotion of revolution. Language itself reveals the link between shame and rage and violence. People, including me and you, get indignant when we experience an indignity. Some shame can lead to anger and rage and violence against ourselves, as in depression or suicidal thoughts, and sometimes against others, as in my slap. If I'd been trained to fight, or if I'd had a gun I knew how to use, who knows what might have happened after that laugh. It's all hypothetical, but none of the outcomes I can imagine are good at all. I'm sure you'll agree. The hypothetical outcome, I'm sure you're curious to know, was this. A woman, larger than me and larger than that man, swept up to my side, took my arm, led me across the plank to the boat, to the next plank, to the next boat, shepherded me ashore and to safety. I never saw the man or the woman ever again. I also never forgot what it felt like to be looked down on like that. And I'll never let myself forget the violent urge and action that rose up from deep inside me when I felt that way. In response to indignity, I became indignant, dangerous, and yes, violent. Quoting psychoanalysts, sociologists, criminologists, and biologists who long ago rejected, listen carefully, rejected the concept of an aggressive instinct as an innate or independent motivational force like hunger. It's not just by nature that we are destined to be violent, in other words. Gilligan writes, the purpose of violence is to force respect from other people. It's certainly what I wanted from that man, respect, but didn't get with my slap. Gilligan tells story after story in which one man after another says the equivalent of this. I never got so much respect before in my life as when I first pointed a gun at some dude's face. We all want justice. We all want respect. We all want to be recognized. We all want to be dignified. And that's not what happens to us. To no one consistently, and to many, never. The disrespect we experience at home and in school or at work or on the street, in the subway, at restaurants, historically sometimes because of a group we identify with or belong to, or because of the color of our skin or our profession. Police officers often are disrespected, or our religion has a lasting impact on our psyches, so that at a certain point, even something trivial, and it often ends up being something trivial, like someone gives us a dirty look, or flirts with our partner, or calls us a name, or bumps into our car, or we fail a test, can lead to anger and acts of violence, and sometimes even murder. In response to these acts of violence, the moral and legal points of view which dominate our TV shows and our Hollywood movies are how evil or how heroic was this particular act of violence, and how much punishment or reward does the person who did it deserve? But Gilligan's approach shifts the question from punishment or reward to diagnosis and prevention, which is much more useful because it helps me understand not only myself, but what we've seen throughout history and what we're seeing today. For example, no one would argue that slavery was not a mass experiment in extreme disrespect for a very prolonged period of time. And the reality of Jim Crow laws, the existence of the Ku Klux Klan, and every effort today to curtail and limit voting rights so poor people and people of color don't have access to the power of the polls are extensions and continuations of a culture of disrespect for people of color, poor people, and often immigrants. Our great American story, or fib, or lie, if you like, that anyone can make it here only adds to the shame of being poor in America today. The fact that more black Americans or poor Americans haven't become more violent against white wealthy Americans is actually a moral and spiritual victory, which we will touch on next week when we explore the roots and causes and impact of the spiritual discipline of nonviolence. Gilligan's analysis of the causes and methods to prevent violence also helps me understand what we're hearing in conversations and news reports and debates about law enforcement right now. We rightly hold our police officers to very high standards, which are essential to the functioning of a democracy. Just as it's foolish and unrealistic to expect our police forces to solve or resolve violence in our communities without a lot of change and improvement in our schools, our health care, our mental health care, etc., our police are powerful moral teachers, teaching us, however an arrest ends, and whatever the intention behind the stop was, they are teaching us with every action they take. Quoting former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, listen to what he said. Our government is the potent omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for laws. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. Violence is as contagious as other deadly diseases because it can be easily taught, just not caught. It's taught in our homes and in our schools and on our streets and in our prisons and these days in our political debates. We can choose, of course, to be teachers of nonviolence, which is why we'll talk about nonviolence next week. And our police officers, with whom we entrust the right and the responsibility to use violence when necessary so we won't have to, good liberals need to remember that. We do depend on our police officers to use violence when necessary so we won't have to. They can and need to show by example that violence is always a last resort. Law enforcement officials can and must work with elected leaders and groups of citizens, as officials in various states are beginning to do, to change police culture so that inappropriate acts of violence are condemned, especially those that are racially motivated. But this week, we are tired. We are tired. We are battered by the news and the continuing and seemingly increasing acts of violence here and around the world. Our hearts and minds and our spirits are black and blue. Many of us are more afraid than we've ever been before. But my message to you this morning is that there are things we can do in response to these acts of violence. We are not helpless and we are not powerless. If disrespect is the source of violence, which I've tried to persuade you this morning, if disrespect leads to feelings like shame and then cover up emotions like anger and then to acts of violence with which we try to reclaim our dignity, then in response to the violence spreading around the world today, we can practice being respectful. I'm not saying you will stop a violent person in their tracks, an act of being violent, by showing respect. I don't recommend that. Don't try that at home. I am saying, though, that by showing each other and ourselves more respect right now, every day, each and every day, day after day, we are inoculating ourselves, our families, and our communities against the spread of more violence. It seems that what the world really needs now is respect. Sweet respect, an essential element of love beyond belief. So this week, as you get into polarized conversations with friends or neighbors or church members, or find yourself avoiding those conversations, especially with people you disagree with in politics or religion, at work and at home, show respect. And remember this, the most effective way to show respect is very, very simple. It's just to listen. Not to argue, but to listen. Words are an alternative to violence. They may be our most powerful preventative medicine against violence. They are the way we release the hurt and the pain, the shame and the anger without having to physically harm someone in order to recover our sense of self and our pride. And someone else needs to be there to listen when someone's hurting. And attention is a form of respect. And respect always precedes trust. We know, of course, that we need to build more trust between police and people of color in our communities. People say it over and over and over again, but respect is the way to get there. Respect has to come first, and it has to go in both directions. I was asked this weekend, actually, by one of our Black members to sit and listen to her stories, to her experiences of hurt and disappointment and anger and even rage. And I can't say now, but I'll tell you next week how it will feel to listen. But I am committed to listening without letting any of my own white guilt or shame get in the way of hearing her pain. Truth-telling comes first, then peace, possibly reparations, like amends for those of you who practice the 12 steps, and then, only then, reconciliation. When that man laughed at me so long ago, and I hope you're noticing how long the impact of one serious, disrespectful action lasts, he was communicating to me that my most forceful act of resistance meant nothing to him. To him, it was as if I had done nothing when I slapped him. I wasn't somebody worthy of any respect, any notice at all, is what it felt like. It's only now that I can see that his laughter was his own response to his own shame. I hit him in public, in front of other men and women in his community. I don't know anything about the relationships he had with the other people on that boat. He may have been and did successfully intimidate me and make me feel small, but that may have been because I had already done the same to him. One could ask which action was worse, his or mine. But I'm more interested by the fact that my slap and his laugh were both motivated by the powerful emotion we call shame. Which is worse? A white police officer killing a black man? Or a black man killing a white police officer? There are questions that lead the conversation backwards instead of forwards in our personal lives, in politics, and in religion. This is one of those kinds of questions. It might be much more useful this week to ask each other, when and why and under what conditions would you kill someone? When and why and under what conditions would you be grateful when a police officer did the killing for you? Remember the first recorded murder when Cain killed Abel. We have to assume that they were of the same race, even of the same tribe, and that they were both responsible for upholding whatever laws existed at the time. But the greatest authority of all, God, disrespected Cain, and we know what happened next. Knowing as we do now that murderous violence is not innate, knowing all we do now about the human psyche, it's time to talk about violence as a preventable disease and to act upon that knowledge. This is not an either-or moment in history. This is not a time for either-or personalities or politics. This is a both-and moment, not a bland moment, a both-and moment, full of color and spice, helping us see and hold more complexity. I talked to 2 Tulsa Police Department officers this week, both black, one a woman. Just looking and talking with them, I could feel the cognitive dissonance in my mind as I wrestled with the events of the week. Who's right and who's wrong? The Black Lives Matter activists or the police? Until my mind stopped struggling and I realized both and. By their very existence, the black officers I spoke with embodied the significance of this moment in history. They know and live every day the indignity of being at risk because of the color of their skin, and they understand and practice the use of force to maintain law and order in order to grant all of us our dignity. They are both and. Black people who know the reality, the cruelty, and the injustice of systemic racism, and police who know how to use violence so we won't have to. Their existence proves that what's happening today is not a moral tale about who is good and bad, but is simply a tragedy that we can stop because violent deaths are always and will always be tragic. And in Gilligan's words, either we will learn to end violence as a means of resolving disputes and pursuing our goals, or it will end us. We cannot and must not pit the value of one life against another. That won't lead us to justice. So this is a both and moment. And I believe the Black Lives Matter movement is a both and movement, so I support it unconditionally. Leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement have been explaining lately that they never said only Black Lives Matter, but this is where only fits in, and this is how we'll close. this morning, because it's only when our north side schools are equally funded with our south side schools and teachers are paid a living wage or better all over this city. It's only when healthcare is affordable for every taxpayer and doctors, nurses, and PAs can afford to go to school and carry insurance. It's only when women receive as much for their work as men and people with non-conforming gender expressions are not threatened by bullies and other acts of violence. It's only when men can stay home and women can be president of the United States of America. It's only when black and brown people aren't stopped and booked or beat up more often than white people for minor violations, and black and brown and Asian police officers aren't accused of being traitors because of what they do. It's only then, and we're not there yet, folks, that we'll be able to say proudly, all lives matter. Finally, enfin, all lives actually matter. So to close, I want to invite you to say it with me. I'm going to shout out both, and you're going to shout out and. Are you ready? This is a both and world. Both. And. Both. And. Both. And. Amen.
We are your church, and we are proud to be your church, or at least a church that's having a positive impact on your life. I am personally blessed to be your minister, or at least a minister who you're allowing to speak into your life. I hope you'll support our ministry and share your love beyond belief by texting LOVE-BB to 41444 or go to our website. But you can just text LOVE-BB to 41444 and make your gift. It's wonderful. Thank you. Be blessed and be a blessing.